My uncle is defrauding disabled veterans, and he stood up in a federal courtroom and told the judge I was too unstable to know it. In the middle of a benefits fraud hearing, Daniel, my mother's older brother, pointed his whole hand at me like I was a stray dog that wandered into the wrong building. He said I was a broken, paranoid soldier who couldn't tell reality from a bad dream anymore, that I'd been discharged for instability, not injury, and that everyone in this room should be ashamed for even listening to me. I sat there in my dress uniform, spine straight, hands flat on my knees, and I said nothing. The judge, a woman named Patricia Coleman, did not look away from me. She let the silence sit there like a held breath. And then she leaned into her microphone and asked him a question that made the court reporter's fingers stop moving completely. Before I tell you exactly what she asked and exactly what I did after, hit like and subscribe, and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. This story might reach somebody who's being gaslit by their own family right now, and I need them to know it's survivable. Judge Coleman's question hit the room like a dropped tray of glass. Nobody gasped. Nobody whispered to their neighbor. The whole courtroom just seemed to lean an inch closer, the air pressure changing the way it does before a storm rolls over open desert. The only sound was the courthouse's old radiator, ticking somewhere behind the bench. A slow, metallic knock that nobody in that room was paying attention to, except me. Daniel's hand, the one he'd been jabbing at me a second earlier, froze midair. His fingers curled slightly, like he was trying to remember what he'd been about to say. I watched a muscle twitch under his left eye, small, involuntary, the kind of thing you catch when you've spent years learning to read a face for the half second before it decides to lie to you. I didn't move. I'd learned a long time ago that stillness is its own kind of language. And in a room like this, it says more than shouting ever could. My uncle was a man who built his whole identity on being the loudest person in any room he walked into, and right now, for the first time in longer than I could remember, he had absolutely nothing to say. Judge Coleman's question had done what 4 years of silence from me never could. It had taken his oxygen away in front of witnesses. My spine stayed locked against the hard bench, shoulders squared, chin level. I've spent time in places where the temperature of a room can tell you whether you're about to get shot at, and you learn to read that shift before it happens. This was that shift. Daniel's mouth opened, the dry click of his lips audible in the dead quiet, but nothing came out. He was a man used to filling silences with his own voice, used to writing checks or making calls until a problem simply stopped existing. But under a federal seal, none of that currency meant a thing. I kept my eyes fixed just past his shoulder, on the seam of the wood paneling behind him. You never give a man like that eye contact when he's unraveling. I'd spent 3 years as a logistics and fraud investigator attached to a Veterans Affairs oversight unit before I was pulled onto this exact case. And if there's one thing that job teaches you, it's that looking a manipulator dead in the eye while he's falling apart just hands him a stage. I wasn't going to give him one more second of my attention than the law required. His blazer, department store navy, the kind that always looks slightly too tight across the shoulders, rustled as his chest rose and fell too fast. His collar had gone damp. A bead of sweat caught the fluorescent light above the defense table and rolled slowly toward his jaw. 4 months ago, that same man had sat across from me at my grandmother's kitchen table and told me, with a mouthful of her pot roast, that my discharge paperwork proved what everyone already suspected about me. 4 months earlier, on a gray Sunday afternoon in March, my grandmother's kitchen in Waynesboro smelled like rosemary and burnt coffee, the same smell it had carried my entire childhood. I sat at the corner of the table in my civilian clothes, jeans, and an old army sweatshirt, posture still automatic and rigid even out of uniform. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't check it. I'd learned that habit in briefing rooms where checking your phone at the wrong second could get someone killed. Daniel sat at the head of the table because he'd appointed himself the head of the table the year my grandfather died, and nobody in the family had ever bothered to correct him. He worked as a regional director for a company called Coreline Veteran Support Services, a name that sounded official enough that most people never asked what it actually did. I'd asked. That was the whole problem. You know, he said, cutting into the pot roast with more force than the meat required. I had one of my caseworkers ask about you last week, wanted your discharge status for a file. He didn't look up. I told her not to bother. Medical separation, unspecified psychiatric factors. That's not exactly something we put on a poster, is it? The heat crawled up the back of my neck before I could stop it. 4 years of active duty, 2 deployments doing forensic audits on contractor invoices in combat zones, and my entire service had just been reduced to a line item he'd apparently pulled from a file he had no legal right to access. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him my separation was administrative, tied to a hearing injury from a mortar strike outside Kandahar. Nothing psychiatric about it at all. I'd learned that arguing with a narcissist mid-meal is like trying to put out a grease fire with water. You just feed it. You're lucky the government still cuts you a check every month, he continued, reaching for his wine. Some of us actually work for a living, build something real. He gestured vaguely at the air, as if Coreline's regional office, a converted strip mall unit next to a nail salon, represented some kind of empire. But I guess when you can't hack it out here, Uncle Sam's happy to keep paying you to sit around. I looked down at my plate. I speared a piece of carrot and ate it slowly. You don't waste calories arguing with a man who's already decided what you are. I let the silence answer for me, and I watched him mistake it, the way people like him always do, for defeat. He had no idea that 6 weeks before that dinner, I'd been sitting in a secure conference room at a VA Office of Inspector General Field Division, being handed a case file with his company's name stamped across the header in red. He had no idea I wasn't just a former investigator anymore. I'd been brought back on contract, this time as lead auditor on a joint task force built specifically to trace a pattern of fraudulent disability claims processed through third-party veteran service organizations across 3 states. He had no idea that Coreline Veteran Support Services was already on a list, and that I was the reason it had gotten there. 2 months before that dinner, on an ordinary Tuesday, I'd been sitting in my apartment in Roanoke going through a stack of case referrals when I found his company's name for the first time. My coffee had gone cold on the counter. I remember setting my pen down very carefully, the way you set down anything when your hands have suddenly decided they don't want to be trusted. Coreline had submitted 41 disability rating packages over 18 months, all flagged for a pattern that made my stomach turn before I even finished reading the summary. Inflated PTSD and TBI ratings, built on boilerplate psychiatric evaluations, all signed by the same contracted physician, a man named Dr. Everett Ray, who, according to public records, had also been photographed at 2 separate Coreline company golf outings. The scheme was almost elegant in its cruelty. Coreline would approach veterans, real veterans, often ones struggling with paperwork or overwhelmed by the claims process, and offer to handle their disability filing for a processing fee, typically a percentage of the first year's retroactive back pay. Dr. Ray would inflate their ratings well beyond what their actual conditions supported, sometimes fabricating symptoms entirely, guaranteeing a higher payout that made Coreline's cut significantly larger. Some veterans got a small taste of real benefits and never asked questions. Others, the ones who did ask, who wanted to see their actual evaluation notes, found themselves quietly dropped from Coreline's client list, with vague explanations about administrative errors. My job for the next 6 weeks was to find out exactly how deep it went, and whether Daniel himself had signed off on the fabricated evaluations, or whether he could claim, as I suspected he'd try to, that he'd simply been too disconnected from the caseworkers under him to know. I built the case the way I'd been trained to build anything, slowly, quietly, without a single wasted motion. I pulled banking subpoenas through the task force's legal counsel. I cross-referenced Dr. Ray's evaluation timestamps against his actual documented office hours and found 16 evaluations logged during weeks he was, according to his own clinic's calendar, out of the country. I traced retainer payments from 41 veteran clients into a shell entity called Meridian Advisory Group, which existed on paper for exactly one purpose: funneling Coreline's inflated processing fees somewhere the state auditors wouldn't think to look. Meridian's registered agent was a paralegal who'd never once responded to a deposition request. Its sole authorized signatory was Daniel. I didn't tell my family what I was working on. I never do. You don't warn a suspect that you're circling, even when the suspect calls you sweetheart at Thanksgiving and asks when you're finally going to get a real job. I let him keep talking. I let him keep signing things. Every signature he put on a Meridian withdrawal form was one more nail, and he was hammering them in himself, one contemptuous comment at a time, without a single idea what he was building toward. 3 weeks before the hearing, on a Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was reviewing surveillance photos from outside Coreline's office. It was my mother. and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice before she said a word. Daniel had convinced her, gently at first, and then not gently at all, that I needed to be evaluated. He'd told her I'd been acting erratically, that I'd stopped answering family calls for days at a time, that a friend of his who ran a private psychiatric consulting practice would be happy to do a courtesy evaluation, no charge, just to put everyone's mind at ease. I sat very still on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, and I understood immediately what he was doing. If he could get a compliant evaluator to put something questionable in my file, something about instability, about paranoia, about an inability to manage my own affairs, it would be exactly the kind of ammunition a man facing a federal fraud investigation might want to have loaded and ready, in case the investigator circling him turned out to be someone he actually knew. "I'm fine, Mom," I said. "I don't need an evaluation. He's just worried about you," she said, and I could hear that she believed it or wanted to. "I know he is," I said, and I let that be the end of it, because arguing with her wasn't the fight I needed to win. Daniel was. 2 weeks later, the same friend of Daniel's, the private psychiatric consultant, filed something anyway. Not an evaluation, since I'd never agreed to one, but a written statement to the court where the fraud case was already scheduled to be heard, a preemptive character document suggesting concerns about my psychological stability and capacity for reliable testimony, based entirely on secondhand family reports. It landed in the case file 3 days before the hearing. My supervising agent called me the second it hit the system, furious, asking if I wanted it struck immediately. I told her to leave it exactly where it was, because a document like that, filed with no clinical examination behind it, submitted by a man with zero medical credentials pretending to have professional standing, submitted specifically to discredit a federal investigator days before she was set to testify against a family member, wasn't a threat. It was evidence. It was Daniel, in writing, attempting to obstruct a federal proceeding by weaponizing his own family relationship. I photographed it. I logged it. I added it to the growing stack of paper that was going to bury him. The morning of the hearing, I stood in my apartment, putting on my dress uniform with the same slow, deliberate care I'd give to checking equipment before a deployment. Every crease sharp, boots polished to a mirror shine, except for a single deep scuff across the left toe, a mark I'd put there 11 days earlier climbing through a broken fence panel behind a storage unit core line used to house old client files. They thought no one would ever subpoena. I looked at that scratch in the mirror for a second longer than I needed to. It was proof of work nobody in that courtroom would ever fully understand, and I didn't need them to. I drove to the federal courthouse with the case binder on the passenger seat beside me, 412 pages, tabbed and indexed, representing 6 weeks that had cost me more sleep than either of my deployments combined. I parked, I walked in through security, and I sat down at the government's table, second chair beside my supervising agent, exactly where a junior investigator waiting to testify was supposed to sit. Daniel walked in 15 minutes later in a blazer that fit him wrong across the shoulders, flanked by a lawyer who kept glancing nervously at his phone like he already knew something his client didn't. The hearing began the way these things always begin, dry, procedural, a recitation of case numbers and statutes that means nothing to anyone in the room except the people whose lives are about to be rearranged by them. And then, 20 minutes in, during a recess in his own attorney's argument, Daniel stood up without being asked to. That was the moment. That was when he pointed his whole hand at me across the courtroom and told Judge Coleman that the woman sitting at the government's table wasn't a reliable witness, that I'd been discharged from the Army for psychiatric instability, that everyone in the family knew I'd struggled since coming home, that a paranoid, unstable veteran playing investigator had no business bringing fraud allegations against a man who'd spent his career, his words, actually helping veterans instead of just collecting a check from them. I didn't flinch. I'd expected some version of this the second I saw the character statement land in the file. What I hadn't expected, what nobody in that courtroom had expected, was Judge Coleman's response. She let him finish. She let every word land and settle into the record, because a good judge always lets a man finish digging before she hands him the shovel back. Then she folded her hands on the bench, looked directly at Daniel, and asked the question that stopped the court reporter's fingers. "Mr. Halloway," she said, "are you aware that the witness you just described as unfit to testify is the lead federal auditor whose 6-week investigation is the entire reason this case exists?" The radiator ticked. Nobody breathed. Daniel's hand, still half raised from his own gesture, hung frozen in the air like he'd forgotten what it was for. Your Honor, his attorney started, half rising from his chair, already sensing the ground shifting under his client's feet. I'd like to request a brief recess to confer. You'll get your recess, counselor, Judge Coleman said, not unkindly, right after your client finishes answering my question. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The confident, contemptuous man who'd carved pot roast at the head of my grandmother's table and told me the government was wasting money keeping me employed was gone, replaced by something smaller, something that looked, for the first time in my entire life, uncertain. I don't, he started. I wasn't aware that this was her. Would it change anything? Judge Coleman asked, her tone flat and even. The tone of someone who already knows the answer and is asking purely for the record. If I told you that everything you just said about her psychiatric history was not only irrelevant to these proceedings, but factually inaccurate? Captain Halloway's separation from service was administrative, related to a documented combat hearing injury. There is no psychiatric finding anywhere in her service record. I watched something collapse behind Daniel's eyes. Not shame, not yet. Just the pure animal panic of a man realizing the ground he'd built his whole strategy on had never existed in the first place. His attorney sat back down slowly, one hand coming up to rub at his temple, the universal gesture of a lawyer doing damage control math in real time. Daniel turned to look at him, waiting for some kind of rescue, and got nothing but a small, tight shake of the head that told him more clearly than words could that there was no rescue coming. Your Honor, I said, standing, because it was time, and because I'd waited 6 weeks for exactly this opening. May I address the court? Judge Coleman nodded once. Go ahead, Captain. I picked up the case binder from the table in front of me. 412 pages. I didn't need most of them right now. I only needed the first tab. My name is Captain Renee Halloway, I said, my voice carrying clean and level through the courtroom. The way I'd trained myself to speak in briefing rooms where a shaking voice could cost credibility you'd never get back. I am a federal fraud auditor currently assigned to a Joint Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General Task Force. 6 weeks ago, I was assigned lead investigator on the Corps Veteran Support Services case, the case currently before this court. I paused, letting that settle exactly the way Judge Coleman's question had. The defendant is my uncle. A low murmur moved through the gallery, the first sound the room had made since Daniel's outburst. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the judge, because that was who I was actually speaking to. I want to be transparent with the court, I continued. My family relationship to the defendant was disclosed to my supervising agent and to task force counsel the moment his company's name appeared in our referral queue. I requested to remain on the case specifically because of that relationship, because I understood the pattern of behavior we were investigating better than an outside investigator could have. That request was reviewed and approved at the appropriate level, and documentation of that approval is included as tab 1 of the binder currently before the court. Daniel's lawyer was already flipping frantically through his own copy of the discovery packet, hunting for a document he clearly hadn't read closely enough the first time. I let him hunt. 6 weeks ago, I said, I began tracing a pattern of fraudulent disability rating packages submitted by Corps Veteran Support Services on behalf of veteran clients. What I found was not administrative error. It was a coordinated scheme in which a contracted physician, Dr. Everett Ray, fabricated and inflated psychiatric and traumatic brain injury evaluations for veterans who, in many cases, never received a genuine clinical assessment at all. I opened the binder to the tab marked with Dr. Ray's evaluation logs. 16 of those evaluations were logged as conducted in person at Corps regional office during weeks in which Dr. Ray's own clinic calendar confirms he was traveling internationally. Those evaluations resulted in disability ratings that, on average, exceeded what the underlying medical documentation supported by 11 to 34 percentage points. Every inflated rating increased the veteran's retroactive back pay, and Corps processing fee, calculated as a percentage of that back pay, increased proportionally. I turned to the next tab. Those processing fees were routed through a shell entity called Meridian Advisory Group, whose sole authorized signatory is the defendant, Daniel Halloway. Over 18 months, Meridian received $461,000 in payments that never appeared on Coreline's public financial disclosures as compensation, consulting fees, or any other declared category. I closed the binder. The courtroom was completely silent except for the radiator, still ticking its slow, indifferent rhythm behind the bench, utterly unaware that it was the only sound left in a room where a man's entire life had just come apart. 3 weeks ago, I said. After learning that I was the lead investigator on this case, the defendant arranged for an unlicensed character statement to be filed with this court, questioning my psychological fitness to testify, based on no clinical evaluation and no direct contact with me whatsoever. I did not move to have that document struck from the record. I asked that it remain, because I believed, and I still believe, that it constitutes an attempt to obstruct a federal proceeding by discrediting the lead witness through fabricated personal claims about her mental health. Daniel finally spoke, his voice cracking in a way it never had at any dinner table I'd ever sat at with him. That's not I was worried about her. That's not obstruction. That's a family member being concerned. Mr. Halloway, Judge Coleman said, her voice cutting through his like a blade sliding cleanly out of its sheath. You stood in my courtroom 15 minutes ago and told me this witness was unfit to testify due to psychiatric instability that does not exist in her record. Now you're telling me the statement filed against her was born of concern rather than strategy? Those two things cannot both be true, and I think you know that. He had no answer. For the first time in my entire life, the man who always had something to say, some comment about my job, my choices, my worth, had absolutely nothing. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent, his hand gripping Daniel's sleeve the way you'd grip someone standing too close to a ledge. I watched Daniel's jaw work silently, watched him swallow whatever he'd been about to say, watched the last of his composure drain out of his face and leave something gray and hollow behind. Your Honor, his attorney said, standing, his voice noticeably thinner than it had been at the start of the hearing. Given the scope of the evidence presented, my client would like to request a recess to discuss potential resolution. That request is granted, Judge Coleman said. But before we recess, I want the record to reflect the court's view on what just occurred here. She looked at Daniel, and there was no anger in her expression, only something colder, more final, the look of someone closing a book she already knew the ending to. You attempted to discredit a federal investigator by attacking a psychiatric history she does not have, in a courtroom, on the record, in front of the very evidence that disproves your claim. That is not the action of a man who believed himself innocent. Whatever your attorney negotiates during this recess, I want you to understand that this court takes obstruction as seriously as it takes the underlying fraud, and possibly more so. The gavel didn't come down yet. There would be more hearings, more filings, a plea negotiation that would stretch across another 6 weeks, and eventually result in Daniel surrendering his position at Coreline, forfeiting his interest in Meridian Advisory Group, and accepting a sentence that would keep him out of the veteran services industry for the rest of his life. Doctor. Ray would lose his medical license within the year, the state board moving with unusual speed once federal fraud findings were attached to his name. 41 veterans would eventually receive corrected, honest evaluations of their actual conditions, some finally getting benefits they'd been wrongfully denied, others learning that the inflated numbers they'd been living on were about to change. A hard conversation that I made sure, personally, each of them had with an actual advocate instead of a Coreline caseworker's form letter. But in that moment, none of that had happened yet. In that moment, it was just Daniel, standing at the defense table with his shoulders curled inward, his blazer, suddenly looking 2 sizes too big on a frame that had seemed so imposing across every dinner table I could remember, and me, standing at the government's table with a binder in my hands that I no longer needed to open. I didn't smile. I didn't look at him the way he'd spent years looking at me. That particular blend of pity and contempt he'd perfected over holidays and birthdays and every family gathering, where he'd found some new way to remind me I wasn't the success he'd expected. I just closed the binder, set it down, and sat back in my chair, because the work was done, and the work had never needed an audience to matter. Judge Coleman called the recess. The room began to move again, the low murmur of a courtroom exhaling after holding its breath too long. My supervising agent leaned over and said something quiet and approving that I only half heard, because I was watching Daniel's attorney guide him toward a side room, one hand still hovering near his client's elbow like he expected him to need physical support to stay upright. That evening, I drove back to my apartment in Roanoke with the windows down despite the cold because I needed the air moving. I needed something to remind me the world was still turning normally outside the four walls of a federal courthouse. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat somewhere around the second mile. I glanced down at a red light. My mother's name. I didn't answer it. Not because I was angry with her, but because I knew exactly what the call would be. An apology tangled up with an explanation. A plea for me to understand that Daniel had always struggled with control, that this didn't erase the family, that we'd find a way through it the way families always insisted they would. I wasn't ready to sort through that yet. Some wars end the second the gavel falls. Others take longer to actually feel finished, even after you've won. I got home a little after 8. I made coffee I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands, and I sat at my kitchen table with the case binder still beside me, unopened, because for the first time in 6 weeks, I didn't need to look at it again. I thought about the 41 veterans whose files I'd spent 6 weeks memorizing, men and women who'd trusted a company with a reassuring name and a flag in its logo, who'd been quietly used as line items in someone else's fraud. I thought about how many of them would never know my name, would never know that the woman their fraud case's whole prosecution hinged on had grown up calling the man who defrauded them Uncle Daniel, had sat at his table, had let him talk down to her for years, while she quietly built the case that would end his career and put him permanently out of a position to hurt anyone else who wore the uniform I still wore. I picked up my phone. I didn't call my mother back yet. I opened my contacts instead, scrolled down to Daniel's name, and looked at it for a long moment. I didn't delete it. Not yet. Some things you don't erase. You just stop letting them have power over you. And there's a difference, even if it looks the same from the outside. If you've ever had a family member try to use your own history against you, try to make your service or your struggles into a weapon aimed back at you the second you got too close to their secrets, I want you to know something. The quietest people in the room are very often the ones who've already won the fight before anyone else realized it had started. You don't have to raise your voice to be believed. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who's underestimated you your whole life is simply keep showing up, keep doing the work, and let the truth arrive exactly on schedule. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to sit across a table from someone who tried to make your pain into your weakness, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments if you've ever had to prove someone in your own family wrong the hard way. Stay steady. Stay quiet when it counts. And never let anyone convince you that your silence means you've lost.